1968, a 10-year-old girl from Scotswood strangled a 4-year-old boy in Newcastle. Police called it an accident. 11 weeks later, a 3-year-old from the same area was taken the same way. The person responsible was still 10 years old. In 2024, a 15-year-old from Walker sat outside a house in Gateshead and sent 2 masked attackers through the front door to end a man's life. The reason was a dispute over a dog. Between those 2 cases, 150 years apart, 9 women connected to Newcastle in the northeast were convicted of some of the most serious offences this region has ever seen. Some planned carefully over days and weeks. One carried a secret for 14 years before walking into a police station. One left a trail of loss across the northeast for nearly 2 decades before anyone connected the pattern. This video covers all 9. Every case is fully sourced, no guesswork, no filler. Section 1. The girl from Scotswood. Scotswood sits on the western edge of Newcastle. In 1968, it was a working-class neighbourhood of tight terraced streets, derelict houses left standing while the council planned demolition, and wide patches of waste ground where the local kids spent most of their time unsupervised. Nobody was watching closely. Parents trusted the streets to take care of themselves. Mary Bell had been born in that neighbourhood 11 years earlier, on May 26, 1957. Her mother, Betty McCricket, was a sex worker who was regularly absent, often travelling to Glasgow for work and leaving the children behind. The family knew Betty was not a reliable parent. Relatives would later tell investigators that Betty had attempted to harm Mary as an infant on more than one occasion, dropping her from a first-floor window on one occasion, giving her sleeping pills on another. At one point, Betty tried to hand Mary over to a stranger through an informal adoption arrangement. A family member had to physically travel across Newcastle to bring the child back home. Growing up inside that, Mary developed into a child who raised serious concerns well before the summer of 1968. She had a reputation at school for attention-seeking behaviour. She had attacked other children on more than one occasion. In May of that year, 3 separate mothers went to police to report that Mary had attempted to choke their young daughters. Officers interviewed her, issued a warning, and took no further action. 9 days later, Martin Brown was found dead. Martin was 4 years old. His body was found on May 25, 1968, the day before Mary's 11th birthday, inside a derelict house on St Margaret's Road in Scotswood. There were no clear signs of violence on first inspection. A bottle of pills was found nearby, and police concluded he had accidentally swallowed medication. His passing was logged as an accident. 2 days later, a nursery school near the scene was broken into and vandalised. Notes were found inside claiming responsibility for what had happened to Martin. Police dismissed them as the work of a disturbed child playing a sick prank and moved on. On July 31, 1968, 3-year-old Brian Howe went missing from his street. When his sister went looking for him, Mary Bell and her friend Norma Bell, a 13-year-old who lived nearby and was no relation, offered to help with the search. Mary led the group toward a particular pile of concrete blocks on a patch of waste ground. Norma pulled the group away before they got there. Brian's body was found later that afternoon. He had been grabbed by the throat. The life had been forced out of him. The scene had been interfered with, marks made on his body using scissors, and the letter M scratched into his torso with a razor blade. Police were now dealing with something they had not been prepared for. The physical evidence, combined with the nature of the marks left on Brian, pointed toward a young child as the person responsible. When investigators went back to Martin Brown's case and looked again, everything changed. The conclusion that he had accidentally swallowed pills collapsed. Both boys had been grabbed by the throat and had the life choked from them by hand. During questioning, Mary described seeing a local boy in the area on the afternoon Brian disappeared. She described the scissors he had been carrying in detail, including the fact that one leg was bent or broken. Only police knew about the condition of those scissors she had just described, something that only the person at the scene could have known. Mary Bell and Norma Bell were charged. Their trial opened at Newcastle Assizes on December 5, 1968. Both pleaded not guilty. The case against Mary was built on physical evidence. Fragments of her clothing had been found near both boys, alongside the handwriting analysis of the nursery notes, her own statements to police, and her behaviour around the families of the victims in the days after both boys were found. On December 17, 1968, after 3 hours and 25 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned their verdicts. Norma Bell was cleared of all charges. Mary Bell was found guilty of the manslaughter of Martin Brown and Brian Howe. The verdict carried a finding of diminished responsibility. The court accepted that she had not fully understood what she was doing in the way an adult would, though the harm she caused was beyond any doubt. Passing sentence, Mr. Justice Cusack described her as a dangerous individual who posed a very grave risk to other children. He ordered steps to be taken to protect the public from her. She was sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, an indefinite term with no fixed end point. She was 11 years old and 6 months. Mary was released in 1980 at the age of 23. She gave birth to a daughter in 1984, who grew up knowing nothing of her mother's past. In 1998, Mary worked with author Gitta Sereny on a book about her life, addressing the abuse she experienced as a child and what she went on to do. She has never claimed she was wrongly convicted. In 2003, the High Court granted her lifelong anonymity, later extended to cover her daughter and granddaughter as well. She has lived under different names ever since. Mary Bell is, and remains, the youngest female offender in British history to have been held responsible for taking the lives of children. The next woman on this list operated very differently. She did not act in the heat of the moment, she did not act impulsively, and she was not a child. What she did took planning, a change of clothes, and a very specific weapon. And when it was over, she drove away and spent the evening playing bingo, leaving behind a young woman's body on a sofa in a house in North Wood. Section 2. The grandmother from Seaton Delaval. Most people, if they knew a grandmother had been convicted of taking the life of her son's former partner, would assume there had been a moment of madness, a flash of rage, something unexpected and unplanned that spiraled beyond control. What Heather Emmons did was not that. She drove to the address with a filleting blade she had brought from her own home. She brought a change of clothes. She wore gloves. She waited until the woman was unsuspecting, lying on the sofa. Then she attacked her from behind. When it was over, she burned the blood-stained clothing, drove away, and spent the evening playing bingo. Emmons was 58 years old and lived in Seaton Delaval, a small town in North Tyneside. The woman she targeted was Tina Casey, 42 years old, who had been in a relationship with Emmons' son. They had a child together, a young boy, and when the relationship broke down, access to that child became the central tension between Emmons and Tina. Tina was originally from the Isle of Man, and at some point she told people that she was planning to move back there with her son. For Emmons, that prospect was unbearable. She had already demonstrated how far she was willing to go before the morning of February 2013. Investigators later established that Emmons had previously attempted to poison Tina on 2 separate occasions before the day she finally went to her home in Holywell, North Tyneside. Those earlier attempts had not worked. This one did. Emmons arrived at Tina's address with everything she needed. She had thought this through. She attacked Tina from behind while she lay on the sofa, striking her 15 times in the neck and abdomen with the filleting blade she had carried there. Emmons' own son was in the house during the incident, upstairs, playing computer games, unaware of what was happening below him. Tina Casey lost her life from the wounds she received. She had no opportunity to defend herself. The nature of the attack, coming from behind while she was resting, meant there was nothing she could have done. After leaving the address, Emmons went through the steps she had apparently already planned. She got rid of the clothing, she destroyed what she could, and then, rather than going home and waiting for the consequences to find her, she went out for the evening. The crime did not stay hidden for long. Emmons was involved in a road collision, and when officers looked inside her vehicle, they found the blade and letters, written letters, that detailed what she had done and why. The letters were the kind of thing a person writes when they are trying to explain themselves, when they understand that what they did will need to be accounted for eventually. She was arrested and charged with taking Tina's life. At Newcastle Crown Court, the jury of 5 women and 7 men needed only 2 hours to reach their decision. They found Heather Emmons guilty. She offered no credible defence. The evidence was overwhelming. The premeditation alone, from the blade to the gloves to the change of clothing, ruled out any possibility that this had been impulsive or accidental. Judge John Milford QC presided over the sentencing. He addressed Emmons directly during the hearing. He told her that she had driven to Tina's home armed and prepared, that she had attacked a woman from behind who was lying unsuspecting on a sofa, and that after taking her life, she had set about destroying evidence and attempting to construct a false account of what had happened. He imposed a life sentence, with a minimum term of 20 years before Emmons could be considered for release. She would be 78 before she could even apply. A domestic homicide review was later carried out by the Safer Northumberland Partnership, in line with Home Office guidance. Its purpose was to examine whether anything could have been done differently to prevent what happened to Tina Casey. The review's conclusion was difficult and honest. Lessons could be taken from the case, but nothing in the available picture at the time would necessarily have predicted the outcome or allowed professionals to stop it. What sits at the heart of the Emmons case is something that true crime coverage often softens without realising it. The narrative of a grandmother driven to desperation by the thought of losing a grandchild can, if you let it, shade into something resembling tragedy. It is not. Emmons had already tried to harm Tina before. She had tried and failed twice. On the third occasion, she came prepared. She chose a specific blade for what she intended to do. She dressed for it. She planned her exit. The love she felt for her grandson did not make her dangerous. The choices she made, step by deliberate step, made her dangerous. Tina Casey was 42 years old. Her son, the child at the centre of all of this, lost his mother. The woman who took her life spent the same evening sitting in a bingo hall, having burned the clothes she had worn to do it. Heather Emmons is serving a life sentence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Tina's story is one that stayed largely out of the national headlines. A regional case, tried and sentenced, and moved past. The next woman on this list generated no such quiet. Her case ran through the national press for years, split public opinion in ways that still haven't fully settled, and involved a 15-year-old acting with a level of coldness that left the court struggling to find the right words. Section 3. The 15-year-old from Walker. Samantha Magin was 18 years old in the summer of 2007. 10 weeks earlier, she had given birth to her son, Callum. August 2nd was her first night out since becoming a mother. She went to Wallsend in North Tyneside with a group of friends, planning to enjoy herself, planning to go home. She never did. Jordan Jobson was 15 years old and lived in Walker, Newcastle. She had never met Samantha before that night. The two did not know each other, had no shared history, no argument that had been building. What happened between them was entirely the result of a chain of circumstances that came together over the course of a few chaotic hours in a Wallsend alleyway. A confrontation broke out involving people in Samantha's group and 2 men. Samantha was not part of it. She stepped in to try to calm things down, to pull people apart, to stop it escalating. That instinct to help, to get between people who were about to hurt each other, put her directly in the path of what came next. Jobson had been drinking heavily that night, vodka and lager. She had also taken a Class A substance before the evening started. She had armed herself with a serrated kitchen blade at some point before the confrontation, and when the situation in the alleyway broke out, she used it. She attacked Samantha 10 times in the face, arms and chest. She inflicted 6 additional injuries on top of those. One strike went through Samantha's lung. Another severed a major artery close to her heart. Samantha was 18 years old, with a 10-week-old baby at home, and there was nothing medically that could be done for her once those injuries had been caused. Jobson handed herself in to police 4 days later. When the case came to trial at Newcastle Crown Court in 2008, Jobson's position was that she had not intended to take Samantha's life. She said she had picked up the blade to break up the fight rather than to use it as a weapon. The prosecution rejected that account entirely and pushed forward with the most serious charge available. The jury took less than 2 hours to decide. They found Jordan Jobson guilty. The judge imposed a life sentence with a minimum term of 15 years before she could be considered for release. Samantha's mother, Alison, said in court that Jobson had never shown an ounce of regret or remorse and that she should never be allowed back onto the streets. The family were then told something that made that already heavy sentence feel even harder to carry. In the years that followed, Jobson appealed her minimum term twice. On the first appeal, it was reduced to 12 years. On the second, it was cut further to 11. Samantha's sister Carly said publicly that the family had been let down from day one. There were repeated delays to Jobson's release after her minimum term approached. In 2018, she was moved to an open facility in preparation for release, but was returned to a higher security establishment 3 months before her minimum term ended, after a reported incident involving a threat made to another person inside. In early 2019, she was given another opportunity through a temporary release arrangement and failed to comply with the conditions. Each of these setbacks pushed her eventual release further back. She was finally released on license in December 2020. It did not last. Within a short period, she had breached the conditions placed on her and was returned to custody. Samantha's family had built something in the years between losing her and seeing Jobson eventually freed. In 2019, they founded Samantha's Legacy, an organisation dedicated to educating young people about the consequences of carrying blades. Since its founding, the group has delivered more than 2,000 workshops across the northeast of England. Alison, Samantha's mother, and Carly, her sister, have visited schools, community groups, and youth organisations to share their story and to try to stop other families ending up where they did. In 2025, both Alison and Carly were awarded MBEs for their services to the prevention of blade-related harm. Callum, Samantha's son, was 10 weeks old when his mother was taken. He grew up without her. Jordan Jobson was 15 when she carried a blade into a night out and used it on a stranger who was trying to stop a fight. The case raised questions that did not have clean answers. At 15, does a person fully understand the permanence of what they are doing when they take a life? The courts decided she did, or understood enough. The manslaughter plea was rejected. The murder conviction stood. What is not in dispute is the arithmetic of what happened. A young mother who stepped in to help ended up losing everything for it. The person who took her life was released before she turned 28. And Samantha's family, rather than collapsing under that weight, turned it into something that has reached thousands of young people across the region. The Jobson case sits in the category of crimes that feel senseless because they are. No grudge, no shared history, a stranger, a blade, and a decision made in a moment that could not be taken back. The next case on this list involves a very different kind of decision-making. Not a chaotic night, not substances, not a confrontation that spiraled. The next woman planned carefully, waited patiently, and carried a secret for 14 years before she finally walked into a police station and told them everything. Section 4. The Confession from Killingworth. On a night in January 2004, 19-year-old Scott Pritchard was found outside his home in Lindsay Close, Hendon, Sunderland. He had been using crutches at the time. His foot was broken. He had extensive injuries to his head. Despite the efforts of everyone who responded, he did not survive. Scott's family lost him. His father, Fred Stacey, began the long and grinding process of waiting for answers. Those answers did not come, not in any form that brought relief. What came instead, within a year of Scott's passing, was something far worse. Fred Stacey was charged with his own son's passing. He was remanded into Durham prison and spent 16 weeks inside before the case against him was dropped on the day his trial was due to begin. The wrong person had been charged. The right person was still free. Northumbria police classified the case as a cold investigation, unsolved, filed, with no active leads that were going anywhere. The years passed. Scott's family lived with the loss and with the additional damage caused by what had happened to Fred. A father had lost a son, then spent 4 months in a cell for something he had not done, and was then released back into a life where nobody had any answers. 14 years went by. In the summer of 2018, Karen Tunmore was living in Towton, Killingworth, in the north of Newcastle. She was 36 years old and worked as a football coach. By all external appearances, she was living an ordinary life. But in July of that year, she attempted to take her own life. When she survived, something shifted. She told a colleague, "I have taken someone's life." And then she walked into Middle Engine Lane police station in Wallsend and told officers everything. Tunmore confessed to being responsible for what had happened to Scott Pritchard in January 2004. She told police that on the night in question, she and a man she refused to name, referred to throughout all subsequent legal proceedings simply as X, had confronted Scott in the street over a debt. She was owed £120 of the total £200 amount in dispute. The confrontation escalated. Scott was found with severe head injuries outside his own home. When she was formally charged, Tunmore told detectives to pass a message to Scott's family. She said, "Tell his family I am sorry." The case went to Newcastle Crown Court. Karen Tunmore pleaded guilty to the charge against her. The prosecution outlined what had happened that night in January 2004, a confrontation over a relatively small amount of money that ended with a 19-year-old losing his life outside his own front door. Scott had been on crutches. He was physically unable to run, to fight back, to protect himself in any effective way. Judge Paul Sloan QC sentenced Tunmore to life, with a minimum term of 17.5 years before she would be eligible to apply for release. Detective Chief Inspector John Bent, who had been the on-call senior investigating officer when Tunmore walked into the police station to confess, described the case as one of the most unusual he had ever worked on in his career. The fact that someone had carried this for 14 years, survived a serious attempt on their own life, and then voluntarily presented themselves to police was, by the standards of how these cases typically unfold, genuinely remarkable. For Fred Stacey, the conviction came too late in one specific and devastating sense. He had fought for years to see justice for Scott. He had also lived with the additional damage of having been wrongly charged with his own son's passing, an experience that left a permanent mark. When the sentencing took place at Newcastle Crown Court, Fred was too unwell to attend. He was in hospital when the woman responsible for Scott's passing finally faced a judge. Members of Scott's wider family were present in court. They heard the sentence. They had campaigned for years for the case to be properly resolved, and now it had been, though the shape that resolution took, and the cost at which it finally came, was not the version any of them would have chosen. The identity of the man referred to as X, the individual Tunmore refused to name, who was with her when Scott was attacked, was never publicly established through the legal proceedings. He was never charged. Whether investigators made efforts to identify him, and what conclusions those efforts reached, were not made public. What the Tunmore case represents in the broader picture of serious crime in the North East is something that does not come up often: a self-generated confession. There was no new forensic breakthrough, no witness who came forward after years of silence, no investigative development that forced her hand. She decided, after 14 years, to tell the truth. Her reasons for doing so remain hers. The attempt on her own life suggests she had been carrying something that had become unbearable to carry alone, but she has not spoken publicly about what drove her to that police station. Scott Pritchard was 19 years old. His father went to prison for something he did not do. The actual perpetrator lived freely in Newcastle for 14 years before deciding, one day in 2018, that she could not continue. Karen Tunmore is serving a life sentence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. it helps the channel tremendously. The cold case element of this story, a confession arriving out of nowhere 14 years after the fact, is striking enough on its own. But the next case involves something that operated for years in plain sight across Newcastle's West End, involving a network of people who exploited vulnerable young women and girls, and the one woman who sat at the centre of it, actively keeping it running. Section 5. The only woman in the network. Between 2011 and 2014, a network of men operating across Newcastle's West End ran a system built on exploiting vulnerable young women and girls. They held gatherings, referred to in court as sessions, at various addresses in the area. Young women were invited, given free alcohol and a substance known locally as bubble, which was a stimulant with effects similar to ecstasy and known to be quickly addictive. Once intoxicated, sometimes to the point of unconsciousness, the women were subjected to serious harm. Some victims described waking up undressed with no memory of what had happened. Others described being told directly that they would only be allowed to leave if they complied with what the men wanted. Some were threatened with physical harm if they refused, or if they tried to tell anyone afterwards. The prosecution told the court that victims were deliberately chosen because they were vulnerable and appeared less likely to be believed if they came forward. The ages of those targeted ranged from 13 to 25. Northumbria Police launched Operation Sanctuary in December 2013, following concerns raised about the exploitation of a single individual. What that initial investigation uncovered was far larger than anyone had anticipated. The inquiry expanded rapidly, eventually identifying up to 278 potential victims across the entire Northumbria Force area. The specific strand of the operation focused on the West End network was called Operation Shelter, and it resulted in 4 separate trials at Newcastle Crown Court, running from 2015 through to 2017. When all 4 trials concluded in August 2017, 18 people had been convicted or had pleaded guilty to offences across the network. 17 of them were men. 1 was a woman. That woman was Caroline Gallen. She was 22 years old at the time of sentencing. She lived at Harside Court in Newcastle. She was the only female defendant across all 4 trials, and her role in the network was distinct from that of the men around her. She was not an outsider who had stumbled into the operation. She was an active participant who provided something the network needed: access to victims. Gallen pleaded guilty to 3 counts of trafficking for the purposes of exploitation. The decision to prosecute her was made by the Director of Public Prosecutions, who took the position that she was a functioning member of the network, rather than someone who had herself been exploited by it. Her father publicly disputed that characterization after she was convicted, telling reporters that his daughter was as much a victim as the other young women involved, and had been manipulated by the men around her. The court, having reviewed the evidence, did not reach that conclusion. The prosecution's case was that Gallen had actively recruited and transported vulnerable young women to the gatherings, where they were then harmed. She knew what the gatherings involved. Her role was not peripheral. She was sentenced to 6 years and 3 months at Newcastle Crown Court. When the sentence was handed down, she was in tears. She was sent initially to HMP Low Newton, a women's prison in County Durham. Within a short period, other inmates learned what she had been convicted of. Her father told the press that she was targeted inside the prison, moved from Low Newton to HMP Style in Cheshire after other inmates found out the nature of her offences, and then reportedly subjected to a physical attack at Style after the information followed her there as well. The total sentences handed down across all 18 defendants in Operation Shelter amounted to more than 180 years. 2 of the men, Jahangir Zaman and Habibur Rahim, each received 29 years. The sentencing reflected the scale and duration of what the network had done and the number of people it had harmed. 20 young women gave evidence across the 4 trials. Some of them had to testify more than once as proceedings moved from one trial to the next. The leader of Newcastle City Council at the time, Nick Forbes, described their courage as brave beyond belief and said they had undoubtedly made the city safer by coming forward. The wider Operation Sanctuary investigation, beyond the specific Operation Shelter strand, produced results on a scale that reflected how embedded the problem had become. By 2017, it had been reported that 112 offenders connected to the broader inquiry had received sentences totaling nearly 500 years, with more than 270 victims identified. One of the more uncomfortable aspects of the Operation Shelter proceedings that emerged during the trials was the revelation that Northumbria police had paid a convicted offender, referred to only as XY in court proceedings, to gather intelligence on the network. XY had his own serious prior convictions, including a 7-year sentence for a serious offence against a child. He was paid approximately £10,000 over roughly 21 months. His evidence was ultimately not used in any of the 4 trials. The Gallen case sits differently from the others on this list. She did not carry out an act of physical harm directly. Her role was facilitation, the movement of vulnerable people toward a situation she knew would result in them being hurt. Whether that makes her crime more or less difficult to process is a question the court did not need to answer. The law covers facilitation. She pleaded guilty to it. 6 years and 3 months was the sentence. Given the nature of what she facilitated and the ages of the victims she helped to access, the family of at least one survivor described it as nowhere near sufficient. The Operation Shelter convictions involved careful, sustained criminality, a network that ran for years and required active maintenance. The next case on this list is different again. It involves a single act in a single house on a single night, but one preceded by a decade of grief, drinking, and a marriage that had been falling apart for years before the blade came out. Section 6. The Night in Bertley. In February 2009, Atakan and Karine Atai's daughter Sophie was 15 months old when she was diagnosed with high-risk neuroblastoma, a rare and aggressive form of childhood cancer. The couple launched a public fundraising campaign to get Sophie to New York for specialist treatment that was not available in the United Kingdom. The campaign reached people across the country. Simon Cowell was among those who donated money. The family raised £500,000. By the time the money was there, Sophie was too unwell to travel. She died at home in her parents' arms on March 11, 2010. She was 2 years old. What happened to Atakan and Karine Atai in the years after Sophie's passing would eventually end in a courtroom at Newcastle Crown Court, with Karine convicted of taking her husband's life, and Atakan's family left trying to understand how a marriage that had survived so much had come apart in the way it did. Karine Atai, full name Helena Karine Atai, was 42 years old at the time of the trial. She and Atakan lived on Jasmine Terrace in Bertley, Gateshead, with their children. By the accounts of multiple witnesses who testified, Karine's relationship with alcohol had worsened significantly in the years following Sophie's passing. People who knew her described a clear difference between the version of her who was sober, described as intelligent, focused, switched on, and the version who had been drinking, which they said was an entirely different person. She had acquired convictions for drink driving in the period following Sophie's loss. She had also received a police caution for biting a doorman at a city centre nightclub. A witness who worked at a business connected to the Atai family said she could not recall ever seeing Karine come in sober. Atakan, by the accounts given in court, had stayed in the marriage through all of this. He continued trying to support her. Witnesses described him as a kind, generous, and funny man who had done everything he was capable of to keep the family together, including trying repeatedly and unsuccessfully to stop Karine drinking. On the night of October 18, 2018, Northumbria police received an emergency call from the Atai address. Recorded during the call, Karine can be heard speaking to Atakan, saying his name, telling him to get up. He did not get up. He was pronounced dead shortly after 11:30 that evening from a single stab wound to the heart. When paramedics and officers arrived at the address, Karine offered a series of different accounts. She first claimed that a mystery intruder had been inside the house and attacked Atakan. She then told officers she had heard her husband fighting with someone, suggesting he had enemies. A body camera, worn by one of the attending officers, captured her sitting in a distressed state on the edge of a bed, being questioned in the immediate aftermath. That footage was later released by the courts and played a significant role in the investigation that followed. When she was interviewed under caution during the trial, Karine told the jury that a physical struggle had taken place between herself and Atakan that night, that she had been trying to leave the house to go and buy wine, that he had physically stopped her, and that she had not recalled having a blade in her hand, but added, using her own words, that she must have. She maintained throughout that she had acted in self-defense. The prosecution called expert witnesses who argued she was exaggerating her symptoms. Defense experts pointed to post-traumatic stress, coercive control, and the long-term consequences of grief as context for her behaviour and state of mind. The trial ran for a month at Newcastle Crown Court. The jury, unable to reach a unanimous decision, delivered a majority verdict. They cleared Karine Atay of the more serious charge of intentional harm with intent to take a life. They found her guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter on grounds of lack of intent to cause a fatal outcome. Judge Paul Sloan QC sentenced her to 14 years. In his remarks, he addressed her directly and said that Atakan Atay had loved her right to the end. He had done everything he was capable of doing to try to help her, and had lost his life for it. The judge was also explicit that Karine's attempt in court to portray Atakan as a violent and controlling person had not been accepted. Multiple witnesses had described him in terms that directly contradicted that picture, and the judge said those attempts to damage his name had not succeeded. The body cam footage from the night was later released by courts and widely covered by regional media. It shows a woman in a distressed state, being questioned softly by officers, cycling through different versions of what had happened. Watching it, knowing what the jury later concluded, is an uncomfortable experience. Atakan Atay was 45 years old. He and Karine had already buried a 2-year-old daughter together. Whatever the marriage had looked like in the years after Sophie's passing, the drinking, the cautions, the deterioration, the picture of Atakan that emerged from witness after witness was of a man who had not stopped trying. His family described the judge's remarks as compelling. They took particular comfort in the court's clear recognition that the version of Atakan painted by the defence, controlling, violent, a monster, was not the man they knew. Karine Atay was sent to HMP Low Newton in County Durham to begin her sentence. Grief does not explain everything. It can shape a person in ways that are impossible to fully understand from the outside. And the Atay case is full of questions that have no clean answers. What is not in question is the outcome. A man who stayed and tried to help was taken, and the jury decided who was responsible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next woman on this list did not act in a house she shared with her victim. She waited outside, armed and ready, in the street where her neighbour lived, over a sum of money so small it barely registers. And yet, she treated what she was about to do as settled business. Section 7. The Neighbour on Sceptre Place. John Hardy was 68 years old. He lived on Sceptre Place in the Elswick area of Newcastle, in the same small cluster of addresses as Brenda Heslop. They were neighbours. That proximity, and whatever friction had developed between them over time, is what put John Hardy in the path of what happened to him on the evening of November 11th, 2024. The dispute, as investigators later established, came down to money. Heslop believed Hardy owed her a small amount. The exact figure was never specified in public reporting, but the framing used consistently across the coverage, a small amount, a minor debt, makes clear this was not a significant sum by any measure. Heslop had apparently tried to get the money from Hardy and had been unsuccessful. She had not been able to resolve it through conversation or through whatever other means she had attempted. so she picked up a blade and she waited for him to come home. On the evening of November 11th, Heslop armed herself and positioned herself near Hardy's address. He had been out to nearby shops. When he returned, she attacked him in the street. The injuries she caused were consistent with a bladed weapon, and they were serious enough that despite what happened next, nothing could be done to save him. Hardy managed to stagger away from the point of attack. He made it to the home of a neighbour before collapsing. Emergency services were called and attended quickly. Paramedics worked on him at the scene. He passed away a short time later. When officers arrived at the scene and made inquiries in the immediate area, they identified Heslop as a suspect. She was arrested. When officers informed her that Hardy had passed away, her response was recorded. She said, "Oh, he's never died, has he?" That response, the particular way it was phrased, the apparent surprise in it rather than distress, became one of the details that sat in the public record of this case. Whether it reflected genuine shock, an inability to process what she had done, or something else entirely, the court was not asked to adjudicate on its meaning. It was simply what she said. Heslop was charged with intentionally taking Hardy's life. She initially entered a not guilty plea. A full trial was scheduled for March 2025 at Newcastle Crown Court. In the days immediately before the trial was due to begin, she changed her plea. She admitted what she had done. The sentencing hearing took place on October 24, 2025. Detective Chief Inspector Mark Atherton of Northumbria Police's Major Investigation Team had led the case from the beginning. Speaking after the sentencing, he described what Heslop had done as despicable and said that Hardy had been taken in one of the cruelest ways possible. He said the case was another demonstration of the real and permanent consequences of carrying a blade. Hardy's family released a statement. They described him as their lovely brother, taken from them tragically and missed every day. They said they live with what happened every day, that it is a nightmare that does not leave them, and that their lives have been permanently changed by it. They thanked the neighbours and bystanders who had gone to John's aid in his final moments, who had tried to give him comfort while he was still alive. Judge presiding over the sentencing imposed a life sentence on Heslop. The minimum term she must serve before she can be considered for release is 20 years. She was 63 years old at the point of sentencing. She would be 83 before she could even apply for parole. The Heslop case drew attention because of a specific quality it has that many serious offences do not: its apparent smallness of motive against the enormity of what was done. A debt so minor, it was not considered worth detailing in press coverage. A neighbour, not a stranger, not someone connected to a long and destructive history between two people. The attack was premeditated. She armed herself, she positioned herself, she waited. But the trigger for it was something most people would resolve with a difficult conversation or simply let go of. That gap between what she was owed and what she did about it is what makes the Heslop case land differently from the ones around it on this list. Emmons had a grief-soaked, years-long conflict over her grandchild. Tunmore had a financial confrontation that escalated catastrophically in the moment. Heslop had an outstanding debt, apparently could not collect on it, and made the decision to wait outside with a blade. The policing response in the immediate aftermath was straightforward. She was in the area, she was known to Hardy, and the connection was established quickly. There was no complex investigation, no cold case, no years of uncertainty for the family. The perpetrator was arrested the same night. What John Hardy's family were left with, though, is what every family in these cases is left with, regardless of how quickly justice arrives. A version of their daily life that no longer has him in it, over something that by any reasonable measure should never have escalated beyond a conversation. DCI Atherton's statement after sentencing included a message beyond the specifics of this case. He framed it as part of a broader pattern, another tragic demonstration of the consequences of carrying bladed weapons in the community. That framing reflects something real about how these cases cluster in the Northeast, how often a blade is the instrument through which disputes that could have been walked away from instead become permanent. Heslop is serving her sentence. Hardy's family are living with what cannot be undone. The next case on this list did not involve a single moment of violence or a single target. It involved a teenager who sat outside a house in Gateshead while two masked attackers went inside, orchestrating every detail of what was about to happen over something that started with a disagreement about a dog. Section 8. The Orchestrator. From Walker, Gary Belfield was 40 years old and originally from Manchester. He had moved to Gateshead and was living at an address on Elliot Drive in the Felling area. He was a father of 6. On the evening of April 27, 2024, he was at home with his son Luke Williams, who was in his 20s. At around 9 in the evening, two masked individuals forced their way into the address and attacked both men. Gary was struck 11 times. The injuries included deep, penetrating wounds to his back and thigh. The wound to his thigh severed an artery. He was left on a sofa, bleeding. Luke, despite his own injuries, managed to get out of the address and reached a nearby garage where he was able to raise the alarm. He survived. Gary did not. The attack had been organised by a 15-year-old girl from Walker, Newcastle. Cretia Beyonce Stroud had never personally entered the address during the attack. She had not carried a blade. She was not among the two masked figures who went through the door. She waited outside while Leandro Lopez, then 17, and Jordan Tams, also 17, went inside and carried out the assault. But the investigation that followed established that none of it would have happened without her. She had planned it, arranged it, and sent them in. The background to the attack, as laid out by the prosecution at Newcastle Crown Court, began with a dog. Stroud believed a dog that had previously belonged to a relative of hers, her half-sister specifically, was now living at Gary Belfield's address following the breakdown of her half-sister's relationship with Gary. Stroud wanted the dog back. That belief, and what she chose to do about it, set everything else in motion. Prosecutor Peter Molson, KC, told the court that the plan had overtures of revenge and vigilantism. Stroud had recruited Lopez and Tams to go to the address. She coordinated the movement of the group to Felling that evening. She was present outside the address when the attack was carried out. After Gary had lost his life, she made comments that the sentencing judge described as horrendously callous, expressions that reflected, in the judge's words, a complete absence of remorse. All three were charged with intentionally taking a life and with the attempted intentional harm of Luke Williams. All three denied the charges. Following a 4-week trial at Newcastle Crown Court in December 2024, the jury found all three guilty on both counts. Sentencing took place on January 30th, 2025. Before the hearing began, Mr. Justice Constable lifted the reporting restrictions that had prevented Stroud and Tams from being named, given that both were under 18 at the time of the offence. He agreed to the application made by Chronicle Live to have the restrictions removed in light of the seriousness of what they had been convicted of. Lopez was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 26 years. Tams received the same. Stroud received a life sentence with a minimum term of 20 years. In his sentencing remarks, the judge addressed Stroud directly. He told her that while she had not personally carried a blade or a screwdriver into the flat, it was beyond doubt that she had shared the intent to take a life. He said that without her, none of what happened that night would have taken place. He also noted what she had said in the aftermath of Gary's passing, the callous sentiments she had expressed, as an aggravating feature that sat alongside the pre-planned nature of the attack itself. The judge described the case as shocking, not just for its brutality and its complete lack of justification, but because all three people responsible were, at the time of the attack, children. Gary Belfield's family had spoken throughout the proceedings about who he was. A caring man, hard-working, popular in his hometown. A father of 6 who had relocated to the northeast and was living in Felling when a teenager from Walker decided, over a dog, that she would send people to his door. Detective Chief Inspector Chris Devin of Northumbria Police, who led the investigation, spoke after sentencing. He said the 3 people convicted were vile human beings. He described watching them laugh and joke before and after court sessions during the proceedings. He said he genuinely hoped they would live long lives of regret. Luke Williams, Gary's son, had survived the attack but lived with the ongoing physical and psychological consequences of it. The judge acknowledged in his sentencing remarks the constant impact on Luke, the recurring effects of what he had witnessed and endured in his father's living room that evening. Luke had tried to get help by reaching a garage after escaping with his own serious wounds. That act of getting out and raising the alarm was what brought emergency services to the address. It did not save his father, but it ensured that what had happened could not simply disappear. There was an additional development after sentencing. Jordan Tams, one of the two who had physically carried out the attack, passed away while being held at Deerbolt Young Offenders Institution near Barnard Castle in County Durham. The prison service confirmed that the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman would investigate, as is standard procedure for all deaths in custody. Luke Williams, Gary's son, told the press that the news made him feel cheated of justice. He said he had not been able to save his father, and now one of the people responsible was gone before the weight of the sentence had truly begun. Cretia Stroud remains in custody, serving a life sentence for organising the taking of a life over a dispute about a dog. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case on this list goes back much further than any of the others, to the 19th century, to a woman born in County Durham who married in Newcastle and spent years moving across the northeast, leaving a pattern of loss behind her that investigators would not fully piece together until it was far too late. Section 9. The woman who married in Newcastle. Mary Ann Cotton was born on October 31st, 1832, in the village of Low Morsley in County Durham. Her father, Michael Robson, was a coal miner. He died when she was still a child, and the family moved around the area as her mother tried to keep things together. Mary Ann attended a Wesleyan Sunday school in Merton as a girl, where she was later described by the superintendent as a most exemplary and regular attender, a girl of innocent disposition and average intelligence. She left home around the age of 16 to train as a nurse, sending money back to her mother. She returned after roughly 3 years and took up work as a dressmaker. In 1852, when she was 20 years old, she married a labourer named William Mowbray at Newcastle upon Tyne Register Office. The couple moved to the southwest of England and began having children. They had multiple children over the following years. Most of them died young. None of those early deaths were registered, as the law requiring registration was not yet being enforced. The family eventually moved back to the northeast, where Mowbray worked on steam vessels out of Sunderland, and later as a colliery foreman. More children were born, more died. At some point during this period, William Mowbray took out a life insurance policy covering himself and certain members of the family. He died in January 1865 from an intestinal condition. Mary Ann collected on the policy. 2 more of their children died shortly after William. Mary Ann left the one surviving daughter with her own mother and moved on. She married George Ward, a patient she had been nursing, in 1865. He died within the year. She moved again, taking up work as a housekeeper for a widower named James Robinson. Children died in that household too, one of Robinson's children from a previous relationship, and more of Mary Ann's own. Robinson's children continued to die at a rate that alarmed those around them, but the pattern had not yet drawn official attention. Robinson refused to take out life insurance, which appears to have soured the arrangement. Eventually, Mary Ann left. She met Frederick Cotton through a mutual connection, and in September 1870 she married him at St Andrew's Church in Newcastle upon Tyne. The problem was that she was still legally married to Robinson. The Newcastle marriage was bigamous. She and Frederick had a son together. By the end of 1871, Frederick Cotton was dead, attributed at the time to gastric fever. Insurance had been taken out on his life and on the lives of his sons. Mary Ann collected again. A former partner named Joseph Natras had moved into the household as a lodger. He revised his will in Mary Ann's favour. He died shortly afterwards, also from gastric fever. The money came to her. By this point, Mary Ann was employed as a nurse for a local excise official who was recovering from smallpox. She became pregnant. The man she was working for, referred to in various records as John Quick Manning or Richard Quick Mann, declined to marry her while she still had a dependent child in the house, specifically her stepson Charles Edward Cotton, the 7-year-old son of Frederick. In the summer of 1872, Mary Ann mentioned to Thomas Riley, a local official responsible for poor relief, that she was struggling to manage with Charles in her care. She asked whether the boy could be sent to the workhouse. Riley said she would have to accompany him. During that exchange, she made a remark that Riley would later recall clearly in court. She said she would not be troubled by Charles long, and added something to the effect that he would go the same way as the other Cotton family members had gone. Within days of that conversation, Charles Edward Cotton was dead. This time, questions were asked. Riley went to the police. A post-mortem was ordered. Arsenic was found in the boy's stomach. Investigators then obtained court orders to exhume the bodies of Natras and 2 of Frederick Cotton's children who had also been in Mary Ann's care. All of them contained arsenic. She was arrested, charged with the taking of Charles Edward Cotton's life, and remanded into custody. While she was awaiting trial, she gave birth to a daughter in January 1873. That child, along with one other, were the only ones to outlive their mother. Her trial opened in March 1873. The defence put forward the argument that the arsenic found in Charles's body had come from the green pigment used in the wallpaper dye of the house, which was a conceivable explanation given how common arsenic was in household materials at the time. The prosecution countered with the pattern, the sheer number of people who had been in Mary Ann's immediate circle and had died from the same symptoms. The jury was not persuaded by the defence argument. She was convicted and sentenced to death. She was hanged at Durham Jail on March 24, 1873. The execution was not clean. The rope had been set too short. Rather than a broken neck from the drop, Mary Ann Cotton died by strangulation. The executioner was reported to have pressed down on her shoulders to bring the process to an end. Journalists at the scene recorded the spectacle in detail. One described her expression as fierce and defiant as she was brought to the platform. She was 40 years old. The exact number of people Mary Ann Cotton is believed to have harmed will never be definitively established. Estimates across historical sources range toward 21 husbands, children, stepchildren, her former partner, possibly her own mother. She was convicted of 1. The methods she used, arsenic dissolved into tea, causing symptoms that looked like common gastric illness, were available to her precisely because nobody was watching closely enough, for long enough, to see the pattern until the very end. In a collection of 9 women from Newcastle and the surrounding area, each case raises its own questions about what people are capable of, what drives them there, and what gets left behind. The final section of this video is about exactly that. Not the details of any single case, but what all of them, taken together, actually tell us. Section 10. What 9 cases leave behind? 9 women. 9 cases spread across 150 years, from a Victorian arsenic trail through County Durham and Newcastle to a teenager from Walker sitting outside a house in Gateshead in April 2024. The geography is consistent. The northeast of England, the courts of Newcastle, the communities along the Tyne. Everything else varies enormously. The ages range from 10 to 58. The sentences range from an indefinite order of detention to life with a minimum of 20 years. The triggers range from a disputed debt so small it was never made public, to a dog, to a missing grandchild, to a marriage that had been disintegrating for nearly a decade. Mary Ann Cotton spent years building a system. Mary Bell acted twice before her 11th birthday. Brenda Heslop waited in the street outside her neighbour's door. The space between those 3 cases in method, in scale, in motive, is almost too large to hold in a single frame, and yet they are all on the same list. One thing that runs through a significant number of these cases is how long things went undetected or unaddressed. Mary Ann Cotton operated across multiple counties, across multiple marriages, across the better part of 2 decades before Thomas Riley noticed a pattern and went to the police. Mary Bell had attacked children before the 2 boys were taken. 3 mothers had reported her to officers, who interviewed her and issued a warning. Karen Tunmore carried a secret for 14 years. Carol Ann Gallen and the Operation Shelter Network ran for 3 years before Operation Sanctuary was launched. In almost every case on this list, the systems around the events, policing, welfare, community oversight, either did not see what was building or did not have the tools to act on what they saw in time. That is not an attempt to distribute responsibility away from the individuals involved. Every woman on this list made choices. Courts examined those choices carefully and reached conclusions backed by evidence. But the pattern of delayed detection is real, and it matters because it means families paid a price that in some cases was extended far beyond the original harm. Fred Stacey spent 16 weeks in prison for something his own daughter's perpetrator had done. Scott Pritchard's family waited 14 years. Gary Belfield's son, Luke, survived a night that took his father and then watched the justice system move at its own pace through months of proceedings. What the families in these cases share, across all 9, is the particular experience of having to keep functioning around a loss that was not accidental. Every person taken in these cases was taken by a decision someone else made. That distinction between a loss that nobody could prevent and a loss that resulted from a choice shapes the grief in a specific way that those who have not experienced it describe as impossible to fully articulate. Several of the families on this list did not simply absorb the loss and move on. Samantha Madgen's mother Alison and sister Carly built Samantha's legacy, which has now delivered more than 2,000 workshops across the Northeast. Both were awarded MBEs in 2025 for their work in preventing blade-related harm among young people. Scott Pritchard's family spent 14 years without an answer. John Hardy's family issued a statement after sentencing that described living inside a permanent nightmare. Gary Belfield's son Luke told the press how cheated he felt when one of his father's perpetrators passed away in custody before the full weight of the sentence had been served. None of these responses are the same. None of them should be expected to be. What they reflect is what happens to real people when the cases that fill courtrooms and news cycles eventually go quiet and everyone else moves on. The question of why women commit serious offences is one that criminology and psychology have examined at length without arriving at a single answer, and this list does not answer it either. What it does is put 9 specific cases in front of you and let the facts of each one speak. Grief appears in several of them. Karina Tay, who lost a daughter and whose life came apart in the years after. Heather Emmons, whose fear of losing access to her grandson drove her to an address with a blade and gloves. But grief also does not explain everything, and it does not appear in all of them. Jordan Jobson was 15 years old, with substances in her system and a blade in her hand on a night out. Cretia Stroud was 15 years old and organised an attack over a dog. Mary Bell was 10 when she attacked Martin Brown. Simple explanations applied across a list this varied do not hold. What does hold across all 9 cases is the permanence of the outcome for the people on the receiving end. John Hardy, 68 years old, never made it back through his own front door. Tina Casey, 42 years old, was lying on her sofa when she was taken. Brian Howe was 3. Martin Brown was 4. Charles Edward Cotton was 7. Samantha Madgen was 18, with a 10-week-old son at home. Those ages do not require analysis, they just sit there. The northeast of England is a region with a strong and specific identity, the Geordie accent, the pride in community, the particular texture of its working-class history. Newcastle is its centre. The cases on this list are not what define that city or that region, but they are part of its documented record, and the record does not simplify or soften with time. Courts heard the evidence, juries weighed it, sentences were handed down, and families went home to lives that had been permanently altered. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.